In 2006, a tense meeting took place inside an old shearing shed. Standing before dozens of angry local farmers, pounding his hands against a wooden table, was Doug Heumann, a representative of the organization that had just taken control of more than 63,000 hectares of land after the South Australian government withdrew from the deal, despite having previously secured funding from the federal government. They accused him of making a secret deal to take over a wool-growing empire that had existed for 150 years. They called the organization an evil force and mocked it as a green hippie group living off government money. Complaints from landowners and several conservative politicians continued to pour in. No one believed that anyone could bring life back to this dead land in the middle of the desert. Even after taking control of the property and introducing a series of strong and decisive measures, nothing changed for years. The land remained trapped in drought, erosion, and exhaustion. That was until the person in charge made a seemingly crazy decision that went against the views of scientists at the time. 18 years later, in mid-2024, another meeting was held on the same land that had once caused so much controversy. But this time, the purpose was different. 26 people, including 16 managers directly responsible for 15 drought-stricken farms, came to learn how to restore water and nature from the very person they had once looked down on. There are no shortcuts when it comes to restoring an ecosystem that has been pushed to exhaustion. To understand how Boolcoomatta changed, we need to look back at nearly 2 centuries of the land's history. If you stood in the middle of Boolcoomatta during the dry season, you would understand why it is considered one of the harshest regions in South Australia. Rain is rare, the sun is intense, the ground is covered with rocks, and the only vegetation consists of low, drought-tolerant shrubs. Yet beginning in 1857, Europeans transformed this land into a massive wool-producing center. For nearly the next 150 years, everything revolved around sheep. Trails were cut so the flocks could search for grazing land. Wells and artificial dams were dug to capture every drop of precious water. Fences stretched all the way to the horizon, while stone shearing sheds and wool stores became part of the landscape. By 1918, Boolcoomatta was carrying more than 90,000 sheep, and at times as many as 100,000 a year. Everyone in the area depended on this industry, so when the idea of ending it emerged, the fierce reaction was not difficult to understand. But there was a problem. This land naturally recovered very slowly. Tens of thousands of sheep repeatedly trampled the soil until it became almost as hard as concrete. Shrubs were grazed down to the ground, while rainwater ran across the surface and carved out channels instead of soaking into the soil. Some saltbush plains remained relatively intact, but their ability to regenerate naturally had clearly weakened. It was not until 2006, when Bush Heritage Australia took control of the property, that the story became more tangible. The last roughly 90,000 sheep were removed from the land, and the old ranching system was completely abandoned. The new managers began documenting every plant and animal species, assessing the extent of the erosion, and maintaining the old wells and road networks. Only then did the real work begin. In the next section, we will look at the most important part of the project, 2 methods that were carried out side by side and depended closely on each other. Without either one, the entire restoration effort would collapse. But when combined, they created a strong foundation for Boolcoomatta to recover sustainably over the decades ahead. For an ecosystem to come back to life, the first thing it needs is not plants or animals, but water. That was also the first method implemented by Bush Heritage Australia. The problem was not simply that there was too little rainfall. After decades of trampling and erosion, the land had almost forgotten how to retain water, or more accurately, it had lost the ability to do so. Whenever heavy rain arrived, the water did not soak into the ground. Instead, it rushed along old vehicle tracks and through deep erosion channels, carrying away topsoil, seeds, and organic matter. To change that, the restoration team launched the Waiparominga Hills Soil Conservation Project. First, drones were sent into the air to map every erosion channel and point where water collected. Machinery was then used to grade back steep gully heads, fill scoured-out holes, and install geotextile fabric and rocks in areas vulnerable to further erosion. Before any excavation began, Adnyamathanha and Wilyakali elders surveyed the area to protect places of cultural significance. For the first time, the native seeds buried within that sediment had a real chance to germinate. After just one rainy season, the difference between a creek with erosion control barriers and one without them could already be seen with the naked eye. But retaining water did not mean the rain would arrive at the right time. In 2008, Boolcoomatta received only about 89 millimeters of rainfall. In 2009, that figure fell even further, to just 56-57 millimeters, less than one-third of the annual average of roughly 190 millimeters. Red dust storms swept across the plains, obscuring the horizon and coating every surface. Perennial grasses disappeared from many areas. Newly sprouted plants were eaten by rabbits, goats, and kangaroos, while land that had begun to recover became bare once again. From a distance, Boolcoomatta still looked like nothing more than a barren expanse of gray-red rock and soil, with almost no visible sign of life. This was when the second method was introduced to address the problem at its root. The solution was not to plant more trees, but to control the species consuming the available food, destroying vegetation, and preying on native wildlife. The most dangerous of them was the red fox. This invasive species was introduced to Australia for recreational hunting in the 19th century and quickly spread into South Australia. Red foxes prey on small marsupials, reptiles, and ground-nesting birds, animals that had never evolved to defend themselves against such a fast and adaptable predator. At Boolcoomatta, a yellow-footed rock-wallaby recorded in 1924 remained the last known sighting for decades. When a species disappears for long enough, later generations may not even realize it once lived there. Over time, its absence comes to be seen as normal. Working alongside these efforts was Operation Bounceback, an ecological restoration program that had been active in the region since 1991. One of its most important measures was the use of bait-containing compound 1080 to control red foxes. What makes this substance unusual is that it occurs naturally in more than 30 native Australian plant species. As a result, many native animals have a much greater tolerance for it than introduced red foxes do. However, this work can never be allowed to stop. If baiting is suspended even for a short period, foxes from surrounding areas will quickly return. After years of continuous control, a 2018 survey at Boolcoomatta detected no foxes at all, compared with previous densities of approximately 10-20 foxes per 100 square kilometers. On a broader scale, Operation Bounceback has removed more than 200,000 feral goats from the Flinders Ranges. This does not prove that foxes were the only cause of native wildlife decline, but it does show that when predation pressure is reduced, native animals have a better chance to move through the landscape and reproduce safely. But removing predators was still not enough if the food supply continued to disappear. Since 2018, managers have removed 578 feral goats from Boolcoomatta. In 2020 alone, they treated 167 rabbit warren systems around the purplewood acacia population, while also installing fences around water reservoirs, young plants, and sensitive vegetation areas. Across the wider Operation Bounceback region, more than 140,000 goats were removed from approximately 12,000 square kilometers during the program's first 20 years. The most difficult issue, however, came from the red kangaroo, a native species and one of Australia's national symbols. Under natural conditions, red kangaroos are an important part of the ecosystem, but as large predators declined, artificial water sources became more widespread, and during the 2018-2019 drought, their density at Boolcoomatta sometimes exceeded 30 animals per square kilometer. Scientists established two 5x2 5-meter fence plots. Some excluded kangaroos, some excluded rabbits, some excluded both, and one plot was left completely open as a control. After only a short period, the differences became very clear. Inside the protected plots, perennial grasses grew more densely, more young shrubs survived, and the ground was covered with vegetation instead of bare red soil. But unlike sheep, goats, or red foxes, kangaroos are native animals protected by law, so managers cannot remove them on a large scale. Instead, during periods of severe drought, when their numbers exceed the land's carrying capacity, managers may receive permits to reduce their density in a controlled way. This gives the vegetation a chance to recover instead of being eaten away as soon as it begins to grow back. The managers had prepared themselves for the possibility that it might take decades before Boolcoomatta showed any clear signs of change. But after just a few seasons of favorable rainfall, the land began to respond. Saltbush shrubs that had once been grazed down to the ground started growing thick again. Behind the structures built to spread and slow the flow of water, rainfall no longer disappeared within a few hours. Instead, it remained for days, sometimes even weeks. Sediment, fallen leaves, and seeds collected in these damp depressions, allowing perennial grasses and native shrubs to emerge in areas that had once contained nothing but rocks and red dust. Most remarkably, for the first time in decades, a new generation of mulga trees began to appear. In the past, nearly every seedling had been eaten by sheep, goats, and rabbits before it had a chance to mature. Now things were different. Each mature mulga tree acted like a miniature ecological island, blocking the wind, holding the soil in place, accumulating fallen leaves and organic matter, and providing shelter for insects, birds, and many other small animals. This recovery did not transform Boolcoomatta into a green grassland year-round, but it created corridors that were safe enough for animals from neighboring areas to find their own way back. The clearest sign appeared at Eagle Rock, where yellow-footed rock-wallabies had been absent for decades. In 2017, a decade after the property was purchased, the rock-wallabies began to be seen regularly within the reserve for the first time in living memory. Two dedicated volunteer researchers, Tony and Meredith Gaynor, captured an image of a female andu carrying a large joey in her pouch on Eagle Rock at sunset. The sight of an animal that had been absent for nearly a century, now moving through its ancestral habitat with a joey in its pouch, showed what was happening at Boolcoomatta more clearly than any chart ever could. The rock wallabies had returned, and they were not the only ones. That same year, field researcher Emily Matthews was driving across Boolcoomatta at dusk when a small brown bird suddenly appeared in the middle of the road. It was only about the size of a quail. Instead of flying away, it calmly walked through the beam of the headlights and disappeared into the low shrubs. Emily stopped immediately. She knew she had just seen a plains wanderer, one of Australia's rarest birds. Over the next 3 months, she recorded a total of 8 individuals, including a female, a male nearby, and a nest that still contained eggs. The discovery showed that the birds were not simply passing through Boolcoomatta, they were breeding there. This was especially remarkable because the plains wanderer is the only surviving member of an entire bird family, representing an evolutionary lineage that has existed for around 60 million years. If the species becomes extinct, it will not mean the loss of just one bird species. An entire unique branch of the tree of life will disappear with it. In 2019, ecologist Graham Finlayson found 3 more individuals in a single day. But at the time, scientists still considered the semi-arid regions of South Australia to be only marginal habitat. The native grasslands of Victoria and New South Wales were regarded as the species' main strongholds. During the previous century, fewer than 90 confirmed sightings had been recorded across the entire state of South Australia. The mystery was not fully resolved until a University of Adelaide research team carried out surveys from September 2022 to May 2024. They worked at night, using spotlights, automated audio recorders, VHF equipment, and tiny GPS backpacks attached between the birds' wings. This technology allowed them to detect individuals that people may have passed by for years without ever noticing. The results surprised even the scientists themselves. The team recorded 272 plains wanderers, including 211 adults and 61 juveniles, still dependent on their parents. This was not a complete population census, but it was one of the most detailed surveys ever conducted on the species. With the global adult population estimated at only around 250 to 1,000 individuals, Boolcoomatta may now be protecting a significant share of all the plains wanderers still living on Earth. No one brought these birds here. They found the land on their own, chose the low shrubs for shelter, found mates, and raised their young. Land that had once been organized to support tens of thousands of sheep had now become a refuge for one of Australia's oldest evolutionary lineages. The creeks can now hold moisture for days after rainfall. Open mulga woodlands are beginning to produce new generations of young trees, while along the lower slopes, around 272 plains wanderers continue to live quietly among the open shrublands. Their brown plumage blends almost perfectly with the ground, allowing them to remain right in front of people without being noticed. Of the 308 recorded sightings of birds and nests, 295 occurred within plant communities dominated by sclerulina. On average, the habitat they selected had about 55% vegetation cover, with plants standing only 11 centimeters tall, 40% bare ground, and roughly 5% leaf litter. Surprisingly, They rarely chose the grassland areas that still remained within the study site. Instead, they preferred low, sparse, thorny shrublands. And the return of nature was not reflected in just one bird species. After livestock grazing ended, white-winged fairy wren numbers increased by about 235%, rufous field wrens by 395%, chestnut-crowned babblers by 165%, and redthroats by as much as 655%. The dusky hopping mouse, a small mammal considered threatened nationwide, was also recorded at Boolcoomatta. Now look to the west, where a neighboring property is still being used for livestock grazing. The two landscapes receive nearly the same rainfall, yet they respond in completely different ways. At Boolcoomatta, saltbush grows more densely, young mulga trees are beginning to fill the old gaps, and the creeks retain moisture for days after rain. The low vegetation provides shelter for insects, birds, and small mammals. On the other side of the boundary, the vegetation is lower and more sparse, the ground is hard and exposed, and rainwater often concentrates in erosion channels before quickly flowing out of the landscape. This contrast does not mean that every grazing property is degraded, or that simply removing livestock will allow the land to recover on its own. But it does show that rainfall is not the only explanation. The way the land is managed determines whether water soaks into the soil, supports plant growth, and remains within the system or carries away topsoil before disappearing. By 2024, Boolcoomatta was no longer just a conservation project being observed from a distance. 26 people came here for a field day, including 16 people directly managing 15 dryland farms and grazing properties, along with 10 specialists in training and land management support. They measured water infiltration, examined soil characteristics, studied the carbon cycle, and observed how flow-spreading banks help the landscape withstand drought more effectively. In 2025, follow-up programs were held at other locations, drawing on lessons learned at Boolcoomatta. A place once criticized for being taken out of production had become somewhere land managers came to learn how to retain water, protect the soil, and sustain their livelihoods over the long term. Boolcoomatta today is still not a story with a perfect ending. Every year, its managers continue to face drought, extreme rainfall, feral cats, the possible return of red foxes, and pressure from grazing animals when their populations exceed the land's carrying capacity. Restoring an ecosystem is not like repairing a house. Just a few months of neglect can erase the progress made over many years. Perhaps the greatest lesson from Boolcoomatta is not the removal of 90,000 sheep or the control of hundreds of thousands of invasive animals, but patience. Nature does not recover according to a human timetable. Some seeds must wait for years before receiving enough water to germinate. Some animals take nearly a century to return to places where they once lived, and some decisions are proven right only after decades. It is worth asking, if Bush Heritage had not purchased Boolcoomatta in 2006, would we still have the chance today to see groups of yellow-footed rock-wallabies, young mulga woodlands, and hundreds of plains wanderers returning to the outback? Sometimes the most important thing people can do is not to change nature, but to give it a chance to heal itself. If you found this story interesting, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe removing tens of thousands of livestock and even controlling native animal species is the right choice to save an ecosystem? I'd really love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next stories about the intense struggles between humans and nature around the world. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.